Hello, Toll Panel. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to all the organisers of this wonderful event year on year. Can we hear it for them? Because it's hard work and they do it really well. I've been coming to Toll Panel for many years, and every year it's bigger and every year it's better. More and more people come, more and more music, more and more discussions, more and more acts. Absolutely fantastic. It doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a lot of people put a lot of work into it. And as I was looking at the banners on the march and looking them all around here and listening to all the bands and all the music, and what was going through in my mind was something that was said in Parliament on Wednesday. It's all right, don't worry, I'm going to say it. It was said by the Prime Minister that why was I worrying myself about teaching children about trade unionism? What I said is this: I want all of our young people to grow up understanding that those brave people, the Toll Panel martyrs, risked their lives for the liberties of all of us, generations and generations later. They are part of our national story. They are part of our lives. Think about it. Those 6 labourers living in this beautiful village at that time in 1834, when there was a declining economy, their wages were being threatened to be cut for the 3rd time, and they could see that people were leaving the land because of enforced enclosures and they were removed from their common land, and that they could see industrialisation was taking place in all the big cities. And they could see that the beginnings of agricultural machinery was coming in, which they realised was also a threat to them. This was the time of the machine riots. This was the time of unbelievable levels of anger in all these scattered villages all over the country. So what was different about Toll Panel? What was different about what happened? Those 6 met under a tree in secrecy, swore an oath of allegiance to each other that they would challenge the cuts in wages that were going on, because they couldn't stand to see their children starving while the Lord of the Manor lived well on the work that they were doing. And they were then dragged off to the assizes and, as we all know, sentenced to transportation to Australia and all the brutality that went with that. They weren't the only people to be transported. They weren't the only people to stand up and challenge the power of the landed gentry and the cosy relationship between the landed gentry, the courts and Parliament itself. But what was different was there was beginnings of general trade unions as opposed to only highly skilled guild unions in Britain at that time. They mounted a campaign, they mounted great petitions, and eventually the Toll Panel martyrs were pardoned and allowed to return to this country. They didn't know the journey they were going on. They didn't know the effect of the actions they took. But they founded the basis of trade unionism and trade union rights. And only 34 years later, the Trade Union Congress was founded, bringing together all trade unions in this country. Never underestimate the power of ordinary people doing utterly extraordinary things in very difficult circumstances and bringing about that great change. What they did was brought about many of the rights that we enjoy. That's why I think all of our children, in their learning of our history and the history of the rest of the world, should understand where their rights to join a trade union, their rights to a collective voice, their rights to dispute untravelled power of an employer came from. They came from 6 labourers in this village all those years ago, and that's why we're all here today commemorating what they did, thanking them for what they did, but laying a path to a future that is, I hope, much, much better, with decency, equality, justice and real opportunities for all of our young people. Their work led to the growth of trade unions. The trade unions in turn founded the Labour Party many years later, almost 70 years later. And I am acutely aware and very proud to lead to a party that was founded by trade unions. The Labour Party didn't found trade unions. Trade unions are an important and very powerful independent voice at work. And I think we should never forget that, the power of trade unions and the right to organise. But that brought about other great changes in our lives. One of the greatest achievements ever in this country's history, in my view, was what we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of this year, the founding of our National Health Service. And our National Health Service was founded, yes, by an Aaron Bevan, but in reality it was founded by mining communities all over South Wales, all over the coalfield areas of Britain, where mining communities came together in order to provide a health service themselves. A couple of weeks ago we were in Tredegar in South Wales, the town that Nye represented in Parliament, where the Tredegar Health Fund was set up by miners to provide a health service. Our health service is basically the Tredegar Health Service writ large on a national scale. And now, despite voting against it on, I think, 70 occasions in Parliament, the Conservative Party claim they support the National Health Service. Well, it's a very interesting claim. They support it so much they're quite prepared to hand over its administration and running to any private health company that cares to turn up and offer to take over NHS contracts. And all across the southwest there's health services setting up internal companies to try and avoid running them themselves, and trying to avoid national pay bargaining and all that goes with it. So, when we get the celebrations for the 70th anniversary of the NHS, I'm proud to be in Tredegar in South Wales, joining with those that celebrated. I'm proud to be in Scotland, supporting them. I'm proud to be in London. But I'm ashamed when a Tory government claims that there's something to celebrate when they opposed it, they've underfunded it, they've cut it, and they're trying to privatise it. It's our health service, and it's not for sale. And a health service in the future will be public, and the crucial mental health services and social services and care will be properly funded in the future. Because when I introduced the NHS Act, he absolutely stipulated it had to be about social care and mental health and public health and housing. The NHS is brilliant at what it does, but it can't cope with all the stress imposed on it by a society that's trying to cope with stress, when the biggest killer of young men in our society is suicide brought about by mental health conditions. I think it's time for all of us to wake up and understand that stress, reach out to those people going through that stress, but above all, properly fund our mental health and social services. That is what a Labour government will do, however soon we can get an election to bring that about. I remember standing in this field here many, many years ago when many farmers were opposed to the idea that the Health, Safety and Welfare Act should apply to them. They didn't think that health and safety at work should apply to the farming community. It was always for somebody else. And I was thinking at that time, the introduction of that bill that became an act that has saved a lot of lives at the workplace, that has brought about a better culture of safety at the workplace, did give rights to safety representatives. That was brought about by a Labour government. That was brought about by a Labour government with trade union support. But the poverty of rural areas, which the Tolpuddle martyrs would recognise, was serious and terrible in the 19th century. There has always been deep-seated pockets of poverty in rural Britain. And indeed, even today, the southwest, Devon and Cornwall, can have the title of the low-pay capital of Britain. The lowest levels of wages paid in tourism and many other jobs and services are very, very serious. It was our campaigns, all of us, that brought about the national minimum wage, that brought about the concept of the living wage, and it's a Labour government that will also bring about a real living wage of at least £10 an hour by 2020. But there was also the campaign for farm workers to be paid decently, and that led to the Agricultural Wages Board. I remember growing up in rural Shropshire, endlessly hearing farmers complaining about the Agricultural Wages Board. Why? Because it set wages and conditions. It set them, they weren't brilliant, but it was a floor through which nobody could fall. And it meant that the National Union of Agricultural and Allied Workers, now part of Unite, was able to use that as a basis on which they could negotiate better conditions on farming and food processing, and also ensure there was a forum to develop the skills of the industry and those brilliant, skilled manual labourers on farms that knew so much about the animals they cared for, the crops they grew, and the land they protected. They're the real skilled guardians of our countryside, and we should never forget it's their brilliance and skill that's made the farming industry what it is today. But the Tories never liked any of that, therefore they abolished the Wages Councils and abolished the Agricultural Wages Board. It's since come back in some form in Scotland and in Wales, and well done those in the Welsh Government and Scotland that managed to bring that about. But I want to announce to you today that a Labour government elected in Britain at the general election will bring back an Agricultural Wages Board to give decency to farm workers, decency to rural workers, and allow them to be properly paid. Our estimation is that 160 million has been lost in wages since the abolition of the Agricultural Wages Board by underpayment. But our policies go much wider than that. It's also about rights at work. The right, of course, to join a trade union, the rights of access to full employment rights from day one of your employment. Not months, not years later, from day one. So you have those rights at work from the very beginning. And that we will end the awful practice, and it's increasing, there's now 1 million people stuck in these conditions, of being paid on 0 hours contracts, where you don't know where your wages are coming from 1 week to the other, impossible to be able to plan your life in any way. It will be a Labour government that will end that. And we'll go much further on so many other issues of rights at work and employment rights. Ensure that apprentices are paid properly. Ensure that apprentices are paid properly, and we bring about a sense of justice and fairness in our society. That's what the Tolpuddle martyrs risk themselves for. That is what I want a Labour government to deliver when we've won a general election. We've had in this country now austerity running since 2010. We've had 8 years of austerity. That 8 years of austerity has led to falling wages, falling living standards, led to underfunding of local councils, led to underfunding of many of our public services, and driven another 400,000 children to live in poverty in this country. And yet the inequality has got worse and worse. More than 1.3 million people last year used a food bank at some point in order to try to make ends meet. But the inequality and the tax handouts to the very richest have gone on year after year after year, as the Tories and their Lib Dem accomplices in government gave tax handouts to the very rich, to the extent that now somebody on an average income in Britain would have to work for 160 years to get the equivalent of 1 year's salary of the average CEO of any of our top 100 companies in this country. Grotesque levels of inequality and injustice. I think it's time we close that pay gap, and close the gender pay gap, raise the minimum wage and tax properly at the top end of our society. And it will require a Labour government to do all of that. A Labour government to establish a national investment bank that will cover the whole of the country, that will be backed up by regional investment banks, that will be investing in all parts of this country. And it will also be a Labour government that brings in serious policies for rural Britain. Because with cuts in bus services, lack of house building, underfunding of education, many villages and village communities are being hollowed out. And the villages become the place of retirement for those that can afford to retire there, or desperate poverty for those that cannot leave because they cannot get anywhere else to move to. Surely it's time we did something better, that we invested in better housing. We ensured there was a publicly run bus service that covered all parts of the country, including rural Britain. And that we had an investment bank that was prepared to invest in small businesses and opportunities in those places, so that we do have a sustainable economy and sustainable living in those areas. That is what a Labour government will do. And we're challenging this Tory government on what they're doing at the present time. They are claiming to be negotiating with the European Union on Brexit. You have David Davis, who's just retired, shall we say, as Brexit Secretary, managed to spend a grand total of 4 hours in Brussels in 2 years while he was supposedly negotiating. Their debate is between those that want to come to some kind of agreement and those that want to go down the road with Donald Trump of what so-called right-to-work states in the USA, where those right-to-work states deny trade union rights, deny food standards, deny all the public health standards that we have, and want to allow all that stuff to be imported here, putting at risk all the rights that we have won. I tell you this, the demonstrations of welcome for Donald Trump last week were an indication that people in this country do not want to go down that road of grotesque levels of inequality in an unregulated society. Instead, they want investment. They want investment, and they want an agreement that means we do have trade and a customs union with the European Union so that we can protect those jobs. But we also recognise that many people were very angry, and still are, about the way their communities have been treated ever since the deindustrialisation brought about by the Thatcher government. Don't underestimate the anger of many people in many parts of this country who've seen good jobs and good industries closed down on the altar of free market and competition and replaced by fly-by-night companies paying 0 hours contracts and trying to get round every condition that should be imposed upon them. We need something very different. But we also need a political understanding, not just in this country, but of social democratic, socialist and left parties around Europe and the rest of the world, that you cannot manage your way out of the austerity imposed on the back of the banking crisis. You have to do something more than that. You've got to close the inequality gap. You've got to invest in young people for the future. You've got to stop driving them into debt to go to college or university or get any form of training. Because if the parties of the left and so on don't offer something that's credible, achievable and realistic, such as we outlined in our manifesto last year and will outline again, then you see what's happening in some parts of Europe. The rise of racism, the rise of fascism and the rise of the far right. We have to be absolutely on our guard against those who would seek to divide us, those that promote racism in our society by blaming minorities for the problems of our society. I simply say this: you blame a minority for an overcrowded school, a hospital waiting list, or a lack of housing, you've created a nasty atmosphere. You haven't solved anything. You've just created a nasty atmosphere, and then you move on to blame some other minority. All you've done is created an atmosphere of fear and hatred, racism and nastiness. You've just created something very bad. You haven't trained a doctor, you haven't trained a nurse, you haven't built a school, you haven't built a house. It can only be a collective endeavour that brings about an improvement in people's lives. And it is up to us to say we will not allow racism in any form in our society. We will not allow anti-Semitism in any form. We will not allow Islamophobia in any form. We will not allow any racism in any form within our society. Because we know the poison it is, and we know the danger it is to all of us. Our rally here today is, of course, a celebration of what went before. It's an understanding of the history of what we've all been through. And it's also an act of solidarity to trade unionists around the world, be they in Bangladesh, in Colombia, wherever around the world, fighting for decent wages, fighting for decent conditions, fighting for rights at work. And so what we do in public life, what governments do, matters. I want to lead a Labour government that has at its watchword, at the centre of its international strategy, peace, justice, democracy, human rights. That we stand in solidarity with those whose human rights have been denied around the world. We're told that the Tories, as I can see very clearly, are in very, very deep disarray in Parliament. Jacob Rees-Mogg is thinking very carefully about the future, and he's got so far up to the 19th century. He hasn't progressed beyond that yet. He sees some kind of imperial future for Britain. I see a future where we challenge the injustice, challenge the poverty, challenge the inequality, learn from those that went before, and be able to put forward a strategy in an election in which we can say to young people, your future is yours to hold, to get the education you want, the training you want, the housing you need, and make the contribution you want to our society. To those that need help and care through social care, you should be able to get it, and you shouldn't have to mortgage your life or mortgage the lives of the rest of your family in order to achieve it. All these things are possible, but what is not possible is to achieve any of them while doing nothing about the levels of inequality within our society. And so, yes, we will raise taxes for the very richest. Yes, we will raise taxes for the biggest corporations. Yes, we will give workers' rights, because, above all, I don't want to live in a society where at any one night thousands of people hunker down outside railway stations, having spent a day begging and not raising enough money to get into a night shelter. I don't want to live in a country where people in work rely on food banks merely to get by. I don't want to live in a country where women earn 20% less than men. I want to live in a country where you've got a government that's determined to redress the imbalance, to invest in the future, invest in the society for all of us, and play our part in bringing about that social justice of the future. Tom Paddle-Martyrs taught us great lessons all those years ago. We learn those lessons, we forget them at our peril. When we learn them, we're stronger. When we're stronger, we're more united. When we're more united, we're even more powerful. So, I say to the Tories, you can't do it, you can't govern, you don't really have any plan for the future. Why not give us all a break and give us an election now? Thank you.